All right. And welcome back, guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hageman. Thank you so much for being here. And just a huge thank you for anyone who has recently rated, reviewed the show. If you are at Apple, Spotify, those are the two podcast platforms we are on, as well as YouTube. If you have recently just dropped a review, dropped a 5 stars, thank you. I know for a bit, I was telling you, I was like, yo, this fucking helps. It helps so much whenever you can just drop, hopefully a 5-star review. If you can leave feedback on Spotify, if you can answer the polls, every few podcasts, I will throw up a poll in there. It helps. In the podcasting world, it helps so much. So I just want to thank you guys for doing that. YouTube gang, if you are here, if you are listening, if you're watching, always helpful for you to subscribe. These episodes go out every Monday. So if you are new to the channel, you're wondering hey, do you just get on here and, talk for an hour aimlessly at intervals? No, actually on a regimented schedule of every Monday, solo podcast goes out. And then bi-weekly, we have different guests who are featured. Now, by the time this is coming out, this is going to be in December, you guys have just got the cream of the crop. You just got Eric Helms, Lauren Conlin, Alberto Nunez, Phoebe Hagen. I think those are the 4 I had for November, December. So I'm excited. I'm excited to hear what you guys think. These are episodes that, I had so much fun recording, so much fun sitting down with people that, just so genuinely, sincerely have made massive influences in how I've done things within bodybuilding, off stage. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being here. As always, I do offer coaching. I do offer one-off consults. I'm not going to waste any more of your time. We are going to dive right in. And today, solo episode, we're talking about something that, in aspects I've covered parts of. I've covered parts of, this topic, but I really haven't built this out in a very fundamental, I would say beginner friendly way. And that's what I wanted to do today. We're talking about the 10 biggest mistakes that one can make with PEDs, 10 biggest PED mistakes. That is what we're diving into. And this is something that for a long time, I kind of felt the pressure. I'm everything put out, it needs to be, very intermediate and advanced, because there aren't a lot of people who are really going to benefit from the, just the things that at this point I feel are more discussed online. But I'm constantly reminded that is a fallacy. That is just simply not true. There are a lot of people, and this is typically the case when I have a consultation. Someone's like, hey, big fan of your work, watch all your podcasts, watch all of your Instagram videos. Can I use Anavar to lose fat? And I'm like, oh, that's a strange thing to hear when someone's like, hey, I listened to everything that you put out. It's like, okay, well, clearly I'm not doing a lot to really lay the foundation, lay the framework. So that's what we're doing today. Now, first, I want to say, I don't think that people intend to use PEDs poorly. I don't think it's I'm just going to fuck around and find out. I do think that there's a segment of PED users who are a little more cavalier, even on the female side. And just for listeners, for you guys who are hey, I'm a woman, I'm a guy, is this going to apply to me specifically, or is this overall just general knowledge about PEDs? I will specify if I'm talking about men or women, because as you know, if you do tune into the podcast, if you do listen to the PED content, which is a large portion of what I put out, then yes, I do dig a pretty deep trench into the female use for PEDs. But a lot of what we're going to cover today, it still applies to male users. It still applies. And if you are a male PED user or are looking to become a male PED user, you have to know that there is a lot of information, I wouldn't say just as dangerous actually, because we're not talking, it's not like you're going to overuse Anadrol and you're going to become a woman. That's the equivalent of a woman overusing PEDs or using the wrong PED or using it for too long. It's no, you're swapping genders. You are going to incur things that are not going to return back to normal at a certain point. Now, For those of you who don't know, that is why I started to talk about PEDs in the volume that I have, is because I don't think a lot of people, a lot of women or a lot of boyfriends, husbands, brothers, friends understand that, like, hey, for their female friend, for their wife, their partner, they're like, oh, like, I'm not trying to turn her into a dude. I want her to stay a woman. So I just gave her a little bit of Anavar. I just gave her a little too much. And then things started changing. Things started getting weird. And that's really what I want to help avoid. That's in hey, if you are listening and you're like, Corey, like I hear you, these things could change, but I don't really care if my voice changes. I don't really care if my clit gets bigger. These are all things that, like, it is your prerogative to decide really the threshold in which you say, okay, this is too much. But what I tend to find is that most people have no concept of even the risk profiles associated with anabolics. So that, I would say, that like cavalier nature of like, I'm just going to run Anavar for this fat loss phase. It's really done out of pure ignorance, not understanding that, like, hey, there are things that we could use that are not as risky. And there are absolutely things that we should take into consideration with this use, rather than just throwing it in and treating it like, I'm just throwing in L-carnitine, I'm just throwing in creatine. It's like, no, this comes with its own set of consequences. And if we can really move through PED use in a way that respects the risk profile appropriately, I do think that there's a way to leverage them that ultimately leaves the female user unscathed. So mistake number 1, using the wrong compound. 2 types of compounds: anabolics, non-anabolics. Anabolics all come with the risk of virilization. Virilization being deepening of the voice, clitoral megaly. So yes, irreversible clitoral growth. And I'm not talking about just like a little bit of swelling. Like, I'm talking about you push the line like on this, like it is not going to resemble a clit anymore. So more reversible effects, hair growth, acne, these are all things that, kind of depend on your predisposition to have acne, whether you have oily skin, whether you have, a just generally more inflamed, just skin as a whole, just overall system, I guess, even gut, just because we know that systemic inflammation does predominantly start in the gut. And that's not something that, like, I wouldn't go as far to say as like, okay, well, if we mitigate that, then it absolves you from any risk of, skin sensitivity or, I guess really the responsiveness in terms of acne. Kind of just depends on like what you're predisposed to. If you grew up with acne, that's something that absolutely we should take into consideration when selecting compounds and the amount that we're going to use. So the dose as well as the duration, as well as just overall hygiene. In terms of hair growth, I mean, this is one that like a lot of people, they'll be like, hey, like I already have to get like laser hair removal. It's not something that I want to see any kind of increase, specifically if we're talking like facial, like upper lip, chin. These are all things that we need to consider prior to selecting the compound, because if this is someone who's like, like I've struggled with body hair growth, specifically facial hair growth as a female user, female athlete, I guess natural athlete in this case, who's becoming an enhanced user, then absolutely we need to consider this. I'll tell you a story. This past week, I had a consultation with someone who was put on TRT, put on 10 milligrams a week. So that was a single shot of 10 milligrams, has never struggled with acne, never struggled with any kind of, inflammatory disorder, like autoimmune disorder, but did notice the facial hair growth very quickly. So this was a consultation. She's currently working with a very well-known coach. First question I asked is like, hey, like 10 milligrams per week, where did that take you? Like, where did that take serum levels to? She's like, oh, I don't really know what you mean, because we just went off symptoms. Now, this is a problem if we're talking about something that, like TRT, that can be measured in serum levels, because we can identify like, hey, here's the threshold in which we can expect these masculinizing side effects. That's where we have to be really clear under these umbrellas. Are we using something that puts us at risk for virilization? Are we putting something in place that comes with no risk of virilization, but potentially comes with other risk? So of these non-androgenic PEDs, what are these other risks that we have to consider? Well, okay, so non-androgenic PEDs, we're talking like growth hormone, metformin, injectable L-carnitine, which I know like people be like, hey, is that like actually a PED? I mean, no, not necessarily. It's an amino acid, but under the realm of like things we could use that will enhance performance and physique outcomes, that is something that I think we absolutely should leverage. Clenbuterol, T4, T3. So not necessarily when I say thyroid hormone, I don't mean like on the box it's going to be like the medication itself is thyroid hormone, but we are talking about components that will influence the feedback mechanism in which your thyroid operates. Now, within all of these, each one will come with its own set of risk. Some will have really a more linear and direct correlation with like, hey, if I'm using a higher dose, that risk is exponentially going to go up. Or if I'm using it for an extended period of time, that risk is going to directly correlate and increase. But largely, I would say that before you start any kind of PED, whether it's non-androgenic or anabolic androgenic, it's important to have an inventory of what comorbidities you are bringing to the table. So more specifically, do you personally have history or suspicion of any kind of cancer? Is that something that like previously you've been evaluated for? Maybe it came back benign. Looking back further into your family tree, is this something that we can reasonably presume as you get older, as you move through life, you are at a higher risk for cancer? If that's the case, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't use something like growth hormone or BPC or TB, but you have to understand that these risk factors are going to tip the scale in favor of this went from a very unlikely, very improbable risk to either mild, moderate, or more than likely, projected risk profile. Okay, mistake number 2, wrong time. Now, this is one that I feel very passionate about. I feel very avid that like as someone who is going from a natural athlete to an enhanced athlete, you absolutely should understand whether or not you are using the compound at the appropriate time. Now, this starts with understanding what your goal is. This starts with understanding really energy balance as a whole. Are we looking to lose body fat or are we looking to build muscle? Now, when we look at anabolic androgenic steroids, a big part of what they're going to be really good at is building muscle. That is primarily the best use for them. Now, what you'll see is that this concept of use specifically for something like Anavar, it gets convoluted because women will often, or I guess individuals who are talking about Anavar's use for the female athlete, will really lean in, and I'm not going to assume they do it like maliciously or to misguide, but they will really lean into the discrepancy between its anabolic potential versus androgenic potential. Now, Anavar compared to other steroids does have a lower androgenic potential, meaning it's going to do less of the androgenic thing, which is the masculinizing side effects, which is the virilization, as opposed to its ability to build. Now, the internet freaks out when I say this, and this is not something I came up with. It's not like I did the research, but this is well known with literature. We can support that all anabolics do build muscle at the same rate. Now, obviously, if we're talking about, and this is where I know males are like freaking out, like their heads exploding right now. They're like, yo, no, Tren will build a lot better than Anavar. We're talking like milligram for milligram when we are considering that individual's potential to build. So you have to understand, like women, we have testosterone too. And if you don't know that, like that's a key component to understanding how to use PEDs, is that testosterone is going to allow you to build muscle better and faster. Now, this is the case for men and women. Now, if you take a man who is super physiological, he already has TRT in place, which, hey, spoiler, TRT in place is the framework, is the principles-based approach for how you should approach PED use. This is the way, whether you are female or male, for the same reasons as we tell male, like don't be on Anavar or an oral only cycle. Like there's no sense in doing that because you're really missing out on the benefits that you can derive by having that base of test. Now, the other aspect to consider is that all anabolics are going to have suppressive effects on your sex hormones, so specifically on testosterone. So if we think about, okay, well, testosterone is something that we can leverage in order to build muscle faster. You take an enhanced male who's already on TRT, and then you compare maybe trenbolone or anadrol or super, like you can go like line by line and be like, well, this builds better than this. Okay, that isn't the way I would go about necessarily making, line by line comparisons to this built better for me, because in the state of a male who already is enhanced with TRT, that is not going to be equitable to, let's say, a female who doesn't have TRT in place, or even let's say has TRT in place and is supporting normal to normal high levels, not supra physiological levels, and then adds a compound in. Now, you will find that certain anabolics, you might feel a better response, like there might be actual sensation that is improved compared to other ones. And this is where you should take a more individualized approach. But this framework, this concept of like, hey, let's make sure that as female athletes, we only use what we need to use. And primarily, we only use it in a time where it makes sense. This isn't one that you hear a lot of the higher level or varying divisions of female bodybuilders talk about. So even like within wellness, figure, physique, women's bodybuilding, they are going to be more risk averse. They are going to be less risk averse, which all that means is that if you're more risk averse, it means that you care about shit changing. It means that you're not necessarily willing to sacrifice your femininity in order to get progress a little bit faster. So this idea that like, okay, we're going to put this in when it's the most appropriate. This starts with understanding what the drug does, whether it builds or helps you lose, and what phase that you're in, and whether you need to build or lose. So just as a blanket, because some people, they get really confused when they hear me, go off on these topics, specifically with female PED use. This is for the individual who wants to preserve femininity. This is for the individual who does not want to incur any changes, so they're willing to do things relatively slower or at a pace that frankly is in line with them exposing themselves to less of a risk. Third mistake, aggressive dosing. Now, I get this, even for the females that are risk averse, even for individuals who are in bikini wellness, shit, I've worked with figure competitors who are like, hey, I understand that my division requires a certain degree of muscularity, yet I don't want to incur that so quickly because I plan to do that over the course of several years. So if I'm going to use multiple cycles, I want to do it at a pace that supports me preserving my femininity. And then if that changes, potentially consider escalating from there. So when I say aggressive dosing, what I mean is starting not necessarily at the lowest dose possible and assessing. I mean, you're starting at a dose that you've heard a fellow competitor take. You're starting at a dose that isn't necessarily the starting point. So with Anavar, that would be either 2.5 milligrams or 5 milligrams a day. That's important, a day as opposed to a week, which we see with our injectable steroids. So Primo, Masteron, those are really the only two I'm going to consider using for a female athlete. That would look closer to 15 to 30 milligrams over a week. Now, I get it. Like, I understand it. I've used Anavar before. I have been on TRT for 3 years at this point. It is very tempting to go into a season where you're going to use PEDs, you were trying to achieve growth. Maybe you're coming off, a phase where you're a little salty because that prep, you did not perform the way that you were hoping to. And you have this idea, you have the hope, which I get that. You're hopeful that just using a little bit more will allow you to make faster progress. And very well, like that could be the case objectively. But that isn't the framework I would follow. And all of this is not to be taken as medical advice. I'm not a provider. I'm not a prescriber. I finished nursing school. I didn't even take my boards yet. Soon, pending. But within this, you have to understand that, like, if you can get, and this is, I guess you don't have to understand, this is my thought process. If I can get some out of 2.5 milligrams of Anavar or some out of 15 milligrams of Primo a week versus a day, I would rather do that and do that for as long as I need to. And I mean, specifically with anabolics, there is a cutoff in the amount of time I would continue using them, but I would approach it in a way that allows me to get the most out of the least. Now, this is predominantly why I would recommend, before using any kind of anabolic, to very first, at the beginning, prior to, if you are like, hey, I'm dead set on using the anabolic, this is where I think it makes the most sense to start with TRT. And this is very much the case if I have girls come to me who are like, hey, I'm going to do it either way. This is literally a client of mine right now. I'm like, yo, like, I don't recommend it. Here are all the reasons why. Like, I've crafted this argument against it. She's like, respectfully, I'm going to do it. Is this something you're going to help me with? Can definitely understand like some coaches who are not comfortable with that, kind of, relationship with her. I mean, she's definitely willing to listen to my dosing and duration guidelines, even though I think it's too soon for, where she's at in her career and her goals at hand. It's still something I'm like, listen, I'd rather you follow my advice. I'd rather be able to guide you relatively safely, even if I think it's premature. It is still your prerogative to decide that you want to use it. And once I walked her through what I would like to do in terms of like mapping out the timeline and specific things I would like to instill prior to, I do feel like we're pretty aligned in terms of what this is going to look like and what she can expect. But this is very much favorable as opposed to sending her to another coach, them putting her on 10 milligrams, 15 milligrams of the wrong compound. So potentially using an injectable as opposed to an oral while in I think I've reversed that. Potentially telling her to use an oral as opposed to an injectable, even though we know that technically she could use one, she could use either, but it would be more preferable for her to use the injectable when in a build. Mistake number 4, pyramiding their dose. And this kind of leads into, or I guess ties back into mistake number 3, aggressive dosing. Individuals really putting emphasis on like the sensation and the experimentation with like, well, if I got this out of 5 milligrams, what would I get out of 10 milligrams? What would I get out of 15 milligrams? And in this case, I'm specifically referring to Anavar, but the same rule of thumb, same logic can be applied to someone who, let's say, is taking an ancillary anabolic, so Anavar, Primo, Masteron. They're taking it in an off-season setting, but they're taking it over the course of 6 to 8 weeks. And during that time, they are pyramiding up. So maybe they're doing like for Primobolan, maybe they're doing 15 milligrams a week for the first 2 weeks. Then they're doubling that to 30 milligrams a week. Then they're doubling that to 45, doubling it, so on, and then coming back down. What you have to understand is that overall lifetime exposure, that includes like dose, duration, and the amount of cycles that you run with a specific compound, but just across the board, any anabolics. That eventually is going to catch up to you. That is what we can use to infer the likelihood that you're going to viralize. So people will typically ask like, okay, well, if I wanted to start, let's say, a very low dose, could I leave it in longer? Or what if I did start a more aggressive dose, but I left it in a shorter amount of time? I do think that there is something to be said about using the lowest dose possible for only the necessary amount of time needed. But there still is a threshold in which I would say you need to have the anabolic in place. So individuals who are just cutting shy of that 5-week mark, I believe it was Broderick Chavez who was talking about this in one of his Q&As, and him posing the idea of like, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense because it's like you're using this to enhance what you're going to get throughout that 5-week mark. We know relatively the time frame in which you can use anabolics and you shouldn't necessarily viralize is anywhere from 5 to 8-ish weeks. At least that's what has been reported anecdotally. And I mean, even within my own clients, like I can tell you, having them run a cycle 6 to 8 weeks, that's typically what I lean into. That's typically what I prefer. And within that, I have not had clients viralize at these lowest doses possible, going through a cycle anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. What I think you really have to understand though is that this very like micro cycle that people are becoming more and more favorable to, these 2, 3, 4-week cycles, I don't feel like you're really able to accrue any kind of meaningful amount of tissue during that time with the anabolic in place. So to me, this is just completely anecdote, just opinionated. I don't think that's long enough to really warrant the use of it. I would rather someone commit to anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, decide that like, okay, like assuming I'm not viralizing, assuming I'm not seeing changes, I'm going to have it in place. And then pending those results, I can then determine how much muscle did I actually gain and is the second cycle needed. Now, past this, problem number 5, mixing and matching anabolics. Now, this is something I see very commonly in the wellness division as well as figure division, individuals claiming and really like with the anecdote of, well, this worked for another client or this worked in my own experience, really be, attesting to the efficacy of different compounds doing different things. Now, This is not something that I feel like firm in my beliefs, but very intelligent individuals have reported that masteron can have some kind of effect in modulating estrogen. Do I find that to be the case? I've only used masteron with one client, and it wasn't necessarily because we selected masteron as, our primary choice. She didn't have access to Anavar or Primo. It made the most sense given her goals. She was also a client that's like, hey, she's a wellness competitor. She's like, I've used anabolics before. I've used Winstrol. I've used things that she's like, I'm not comfortable with the effects that this point what I've incurred. So the approach I want to take is I want to be as conservative as possible. I'm okay using masteron because I trust the sourcing, but you also have to consider masteron can be faked. But in her case, I mean, really the question was, in an off season, it doesn't make sense to have multiple anabolics in place. It doesn't make sense to have an Anavar and a masteron, an Anavar and a Primo. In my opinion, no, it doesn't make sense, because when we look at what we're yielding from the anabolic, it's not like we're going to see an increase in, well, masteron builds a little bit better than Anavar. Now, really, where we're going to see discrepancies and where you're going to see people report that one is a better builder than another is typically related and could be potentially debunked around whether or not that compound itself was of high quality. Now, to be honest, right now, it's not very difficult to come by prescription Anavar. That's pretty much something that by any of these huge telehealth clinics, you can just get a provider to write you a script for if you make any of the following complaints. Hey, I'm not performing the way I want to in the gym. I want to build a little bit more muscle. I'm getting ready for a bodybuilding show. Obviously, they are not going to write a prescription for steroid use, but they are going to try to make an argument that it is technically necessitated, which that has been my experience with the clients I've worked with. Individuals will come to me and be like, hey, started with this provider, saw that my levels were they were okay. Ended up writing me a script for, as a female athlete, 10 to 20 milligrams of Anavar a day for an extended duration. Now, when we start to unpack this, and it really, I guess, going back to the mistake itself of like mixing and matching anabolics, what you have to understand is that total anabolic load, as I said before, that is ultimately what's going to influence whether or not you have a higher likelihood to viralize. That's where we have to consider if we have a total anabolic load from one anabolic and another, and we say like, okay, we're going to start at 5 milligrams of Anavar and then 15 milligrams of Primo. It's like, okay, that 5 milligrams of Anavar, that's 35 milligrams for the week. You pair that with 15 milligrams of Primo. Look at your anabolic load there as opposed to just using, let's say, the 15 milligrams a week or the 35 of Anavar. It's significantly higher. And this is something that I think we really have to consider as far as like, is there an actual need for 90 milligrams of an anabolic load per week for, let's say, even a non-competitor, someone who just wants to build a little bit of muscle. So mistake number 6, not using non-anabolics first. This is one that I get it. Like a lot of people will say, hey, I want to just go straight to the Anavar. I don't want to waste any time. I'll tell you a story. So I had a client who, not a competitor, aspirations to maybe compete one day, but she works in PR. She has a lot of meetings, a lot of fitness type events, wanted to get shredded over the course of the next 6 months instead of wanting to use GH, which she was like very prone, like she was very open. She's like, I'm scared to use it. I don't have any personal history of cancer in my family. I don't have any like direct history, but it's one that like, I'm just like eliminating. I don't want it on the table. Cool. Okay. No issues there. We got to the L-carnitine. I'm like, okay, is injectable L-carnitine, is that something you're open to? She was open to it, but wouldn't stay consistent with the injections, which I can understand. But at the same time, this is like minimum baseline what I need from a client. If we're going to go down the route of PEDs, I want to see that you're willing to do everything that's going to allow you to get more proof of concept, more progress with the use of that PED. And for some people, I do feel like it does make sense to have them start with the non-androgenics and continue to run that out before ever including the anabolic to really see like, hey, is this the amount of progress you actually wanted? Because we don't need the anabolic to get that. That's the thing. A lot of people, they will get in their head, they'll be like, you know what, I want to gain 10 pounds of muscle. And as we start to gain, maybe we notice that like weight's going up, they're right around that 3 to 5 pound mark, which is insane on a female athlete who's natural. And at that like 3 to 5 pound mark, they're like, yo, honestly, like my hips are kind of getting outrageous at this point. None of my clothes fit. This is very common with individuals who are into fashion and have a lot of designer clothes. They're like, I don't want to continue growing because I'm going to never be able to wear a lot of these pieces that I've put a lot of money into. Even within that, you have to understand that with the non-androgenics, yes, they're going to take longer. They're going to, yes, offer some support. And comparatively to something like Anavar, it's not like you can say clenbuterol, even though it has the ability to help with muscle building, but oftentimes is used as an anti-catabolic. It's not going to be equitable to that of which you would experience the results from Anavar, like relative to hypertrophy. And that's where I think it makes sense to have someone, especially who is only recently like open to the idea of using PEDs, walk them through and be like, okay, what if you don't even actually want to build the amount of muscle you think you do? Like, what if the fact is like you want to change your physique, but you find that like on the way up there, you don't actually want that muscle. You don't want the upper body. You don't want the back. You don't want the quads, the legs. I mean, this is part of the psychosocial that I do think is an important, I guess like mile marker, like checkpoint for you to walk the client through. Do you actually want to look the way you think you want to look? And if they're like gung-ho, like, hey, I have another client who's like not a competitor, very interested in using PEDs. She's very on board with going about it in a safer route, but she is also like, I want legs and I'm like 5'9", so this is going to take a lot of muscle to have both quads, hamstrings, glutes. I want huge jacked arms. Like I want to be as dense as possible. And with that, I'm like, okay, so this might very well turn into a conversation at one point. It's like, we're not going to continue to be able to get those kind of results just from the non-androgenics alone. Are you ready to use an anabolic? And if so, what does that look like what does that translate to in terms of results? I absolutely think that if you are dealing with someone who is very timid when it comes to risk, they very much do not want to incur any kind of changes, the best route is to take them through the non-androgenics first. From there, consider whether or not there's a need for HRT. Then from there, really assess, okay, is this a decision they're going to be okay with once they use the anabolic? Let's say something does change. Is this something that they're going to be able to live with and concede with and take responsibility for themselves making the decision to use illegal drugs to boost their results? Now that brings me to mistake number 7, having suppressed hormones to begin with. This is one that like I am so avid on ensuring that if you are that person who's like, Corey, I'm going to use anabolics regardless. I've got the Anavar in hand, which is like, that happens so often, guys, where people will just like show up. They're like, you better tell me what to do because I'm going to use it otherwise. And I kind of feel like a hostage situation because I'm like, okay, fucking relax. Like, let's just get something sorted before you just add this in. And with that individual, I very much am like, okay, if you're already going to use the anabolic, I'd like for you to have TRT in place because we know that that's going to facilitate better results. We know that we can give you a little bit of a bump in performance already. And ideally, this would happen in like more of a consecutive fashion where we get labs, we look at testosterone, estradiol, progesterone. We need to see like, are you actually ovulating? We look at maybe DHT, SHBG, free test, DHEA, pregnenolone, thyroid, so TSH, free T3, free T4, cortisol. Don't know if I already said pregnenolone, but essentially getting a very comprehensive view in addition to obviously CMP, CPC, lipids would be super helpful as well. But this is going to give us a comprehensive view of what levers make the most sense to pull. Now, realistically, most clients who come to me don't want to do this. They'll get the lab work done, but they're very keen on like, okay, I just want to start the TRT if that's where their mind's already at, if they're already made up. Now, for the clients who come to me who are very much like, I'm wanting to start the anabolic, for them, it is a little more straightforward because if you're going to have the anabolic in place and your levels are already suppressed, your testosterone levels, to me, this makes more than enough sense depending on if their DHE levels are also suppressed, depending on where their DHT is, depending on where their free test is, previous responsiveness, and whether or not there's any kind of indication of some form of PCOS. These things essentially build a map to, or yes, like not really build a map. They take me through a process of elimination as to what tools we can then play, or what cards we can then play. That's a better way to say it. For the individual who's like, I'm throwing in the Anavar, I'm having it in, like it's going in as soon as we start working together. I'll tell them, be like, okay, well, if that's what you're going to do, what I would recommend is first starting with the TRT. Assuming the Anavar is of high quality, okay, maybe we do put the Anavar in place for that duration, but we also need to make sure that we're seeing serum testosterone levels sit in a normal to normal high range. We don't want them supra physiological. We don't want them above 100 nanograms per deciliter. That is the point in which we have the transgender community to thank for this. We have very good studies to show the minimum dose, the minimum serum level in which masculinization can be achieved. I'm assuming not very good masculinization, not very rapid masculinization, because frankly, I've had clients who've come to me who've been at 200 nanograms per deciliter, and they've been like, yeah, I didn't know this was an issue. Thank God I caught this within the first 6 months, because it wouldn't surprise me if that individual, if at that dose for an extended period of time, started to experience virilizing side effects. All right, mistake number 8, inconsistent training with using anabolics. This, I know, like if you are a newer athlete, if you are not as educated in what needs to happen in terms of facilitating muscle growth, you can think, okay, just putting the anabolic in, like that will be enough to get me to where I want to go. Like I'll have to do very little. And really, I think where this comes from is that you see an immediate surge in fullness, in largely in scale weight, in circumference of pretty much everywhere, top to bottom. But this can be misleading and making you think that, okay, within the first week, I did 4 to 5 workouts and that resulted in a 3-pound change in scale weight. A lot of people will see this and then assume I don't have to be as on top of my training to get these results. Wouldn't that be cool is if I just had this in 6 to 8 weeks and every week my weight goes up anywhere from 1 to 3 pounds and I'm not doing nearly as much as I was before. This is not the case. What you need to do is understand that that initial rise in scale weight is more than likely going to come off in the same amount once you remove the anabolic. So let's say I add in the Anavar, and I've used Anavar before. I've used it in contest prep for cosmetic reasons to increase the fullness of the look. Legit, like it's going to increase scale weight anywhere from 2 to 5 pounds for most people. And I'm talking like 5 milligrams a day. Like that's not a lot. So if you are in that higher dosing, if you are taking a more aggressive dose, I would expect potentially even more water retention. Now, pulling that out, let's say you're using it in a contest prep, you pull it out at the very end. Well, that's also going to be a time where there's a lot of moving targets. There's going to be a lot of things that are affecting how your physique looks day to day. This is where the best advice I can give you is to make sure that you are in a state where you can devote every aspect of your program, everything that you're doing. This includes your diet, your training, your cardio, your recovery. Everything that you're doing should be centered around how can I get the most build out of this phase? How can I put on the most muscle? Now, yes, some body fat gain is going to occur. If you're doing this in short, yeah, I know there are people who'd be like, well, Anavar has pathways where it works on fat loss as well. It's like, okay, yeah, but largely that's not going to be what most people see. Most people are going to see an increase in fullness. They're going to see an increase in performance, but we can reasonably expect these things to go away almost immediately after you remove the anabolic. And this is very much the case for individuals who use anabolics in a contest prep or in a fat loss phase. It's very short-lived. Like they have that in place and they're going to see those favorable outcomes. But if you didn't actually build any muscle while it's in place, it's very unlikely that that muscle or that fullness is going to stick around. Now, mistake number 9, increasing training volume, increasing number of training days, or even increasing cardio or overall activity. This ultimately is going to reduce recovery. So when we think about this fundamentally, we see people that they're like, well, the performance is up. Why wouldn't I increase training days? Maybe I've been taking 3 days completely off training. Why wouldn't I just add in another training day? Ultimately, if your training program is ironed out well, it's designed well, and it supports an adequate amount of recovery, this is really where you have to weigh the cost of, okay, if I increase training days, is that going to then affect intensity on these other primary days? Sure, there could be an argument that's like, well, I have increased performance, maybe I should add intensifiers. And that's something I absolutely can get on board with. But I think you need to be really cognizant, specifically when we're talking about output that is very systemically fatiguing. So when we're talking about cardio modalities, I wouldn't go ahead and be like, well, I have Anavar in place, let me get ahead in terms of fat loss simultaneously, because frankly, it doesn't work that way. I wouldn't jack up your cardio at the same time, then putting you in a position where your body is essentially competing for the resources available. Ideally, we want those resources. We want the food to likely be shuttled for your training performance. And if there's a way to better do that, to better modulate that nutrition, that's what we want to do. Now, mistake number 10, big one that I need you to hear me. Undereating and letting scale weight drop. So when it comes to using an anabolic, making sure that you're getting the most out of it, putting the TRT in place, making sure that you are adequately resting, that you're not overly stressed, you're not doing a ton of cardio. You have to be on top of not just your diet and all of the other variables that I've mentioned thus far. You should be monitoring your scale weight. And yes, that first week, it's more than likely we're going to see a pretty acute rise in body weight, and we should consider that largely artificial. But from here, we should be taking daily scale weight. We should be consecutively comparing the average from each 7-day period, as well as the high and low from each week to the following week. We should also be taking measurements. We should probably be taking calipers as well, which I know a lot of people, they're like, yo, this is a lot. Like, why do I have to track this data? This is really one of those things that I see as a way to enhance the efforts that you're already putting in. So if you know that scale weight's going to go up, and this is really the mistake itself, is that people won't allow scale weight to go up while they're using the anabolic. They'll put it in place, but then they'll kind of get like into the idea of be like, okay, well, what if I could lose a little bit of fat simultaneously? The fact is, like, if you go in and you start using an anabolic at 15% body fat, but over the course of 8 weeks, you build 2 to 3 pounds of muscle, which is very, very good. Your body fat will thereby be lower because you are now carrying more tissue on your frame. Now, the idea isn't to go in and try to lean out. And I think that's the thing that people will kind of get really like addicted to, is they'll see that, okay, I have more lines in my physique, my glutes are, popping more, but I'm starting to see more visibility that at this point I haven't been seeing. And this is where I would strongly encourage you to commit to seeing the scale weight go up for the entire duration of use. So if you were going to build for 6 to 8 weeks, I would expect and really aim for, on average, minimally 0.5 pound per week. So if that's 8 weeks and we're talking about 0.5 pound to 1 pound per week, I mean, that could be anywhere from, even with spare change like in mind, 5 to 10 pounds if we're accounting for, those fluxes in body fat. Now, this is the thing, is like a lot of people are putting in anabolics in a position where they're not really comfortable seeing their scale weight go up, period. So once they have the anabolic in place, even though the scale weight goes up, they're kind of like, I just want to sit here and recomp. And sure, that might work in the immediate. It might work acutely, but you're not going to build nearly the amount of muscle that you could otherwise if you really committed and made sure that you were staying in a surplus, made sure that you were recovering and putting everything that you can into your training. I would aim for anywhere from 0.5 pound to 1 pound every single week of the point in which you have the anabolic in place. Past that, it is going to be a bit of an assessment to see whether or not you actually built the amount of muscle you were aiming for. But this is where I do think that something like measurements, calipers can be really useful in making the assertion as to whether or not your circumference, so that's what we're measuring with measurements, like a tape measure, like literally you're measuring the width of your shoulders. If we're seeing that go up, and we're seeing at, minimum, like the calipers, that's pinchable fat, if we're seeing that only marginally go up, or collectively, maybe you go up, and like, I guess I'll even reference myself. This is without an anabolic. This past build I went through, my weight went up. I mean, like, gosh, we were talking close to 15, 16 pounds. This is something that at the time I was like, this is going to be really hard for me to wrap my head around if this isn't muscle, because that ultimately is not the look that I favor the most. Now, taking measurements, taking calipers, this is what allowed me along the way to make better decisions and really, I would say, more accurate decisions around whether or not the weight that was coming on. So when I would see 2 to 3 pound spikes in my scale weight over the course of a week, and be like, well, I see my training performance is going up, I see my measurements are going up, and I don't see body fat going up nearly as fast. So that to me is telling me that not only is there muscle accruing, but I'm in a really good place to grow. This absolutely needs to happen if you're going to use the anabolic. If you're going to have the anabolic, I do think you should be measuring circumference. So specifically for the female athlete, I would measure circumference of your shoulders, like so here around, not just like here, I guess here. I would measure total circumference. I would measure waist at the smallest point. I mean, that's what I tell most people, but hey, if you want to go at the largest point, that's okay too. It just needs to be the same area every single time. So if it's at the belly button, either below, under, right on top, just make it consistent. Same thing with glutes at the widest point. So the area where you have the most projection. I would also measure the glute fold, which I know this stumps a lot of people, but truly when it comes to measuring the area in which we likely need the most muscle growth for female athletes, I mean, like we need to see the actual tie-in, like the bottom of the tie-in get denser. This is an area while we expect it to go up, we need to be very cognizant of how the circumference is going up relative to the calipers. And I know on calipers, like it can be a pain in the dick to try to measure that lower glute, but that's where we have to find an area that is easy for us to consistently get that same measurement that is ultimately accurate. Especially for my wellness girls, like you gotta measure the leg. And I would even say for bikini, if you're someone who's predisposed to store body fat in your lower body, like in your legs specifically, which absolutely is the case for me, I would go ahead and take mid-thigh, right at the knee, because like the right at the knee, I don't have a lot of quad. So if I see that measurement going up, it's more than likely I'm going to see body fat going up as well. And this is something that like I can pretty much confirm just with having the caliper reading in mind as well. Because there's not a lot of muscle there, that increase in circumference is one that I can essentially depict and be like, okay, that's either inflammation, water, or just body fat. Guys, there are ways that you can go about using PEDs that are going to expose you to less of a risk. And I really hope that this video, this podcast goes through essentially more of a checklist to give you some ideas if you're not sure if you're using PEDs correctly, or if you're not sure if you're using them in a relatively safe way. The thing is, you have to remember that no anabolics, no non-anabolics come completely risk-free. So it's important, if you're going to put something in that does carry a higher risk, that you understand that risk, because truly, I don't think that in this like wild west of an industry, there isn't really a thing like around informed consent. And frankly, I don't think you can give informed consent if you yourself are not informed. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. As always, I will see you in the next one.